I'd like to welcome you to this event with Dr. María Cotera. I'm Dr. Nancy Beck-Young, the director of the Center for Public History, and also Morris Professor of History in the UH Department of History. Dr. Cotera is going to be talking to us this afternoon about her new book, Flushing the Archive, An Intimate Genealogy of Chicana Knowledge Praxis. We are glad that you are here for this very important talk by such an esteemed scholar. At the Center for Public History, our vision is to ignite an understanding of our diverse pasts by collaborating with and training historically minded students, practitioners, and the public through community-driven programming and scholarship. One of the ways that we do this is through the CPH lecture series, which provides funding for unique opportunities like this book talk, also for scholars, professionals, community leaders, artists, and others to consider the humanities perspectives directly related to the decisions that they make. And I'll take a point of personal privilege just to say now, at this particular moment in the year 2026, it is so important to bring the humanities into all of the thinking we do about problems that range from the large to the small and everything in between. So I encourage you to do more of that sort of thinking. Dr. Cotera is a long-standing friend of ours at the Center for Public History and the University of Houston, and specifically the Sharing Stories from 1977 project, where she has been on our advisory board helping us plod along step by step. And I'd like to say a few more things about Dr. Cotera. She is professor of history, or when I say professor of, I automatically just say history, which is
That's okay.
Sorry. She is professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Her first book, Native Speakers, was duly awarded, and her groundbreaking volume, Chicana Movidas, has been adopted in courses across the country, and I expect that this book will also be awarded with prizes and excellent reviews. And just in case you think that's not enough, Dr. Cotera has also been building Chicana por mi Raza, a digital memory project, along with project co-director Linda Garcia Merchant, who, okay, so yeah, okay, who is also here at the University of Houston. That project, if you haven't checked it out, you should do so. It's amazing, it's inspiring, and we'll hear more about it in the talk. Dr. Cotera, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, for such a wonderful introduction. I always cherish my time here at the University of Houston. Every time I come, I feel so welcomed, and I feel so, in community with like-minded people. I really love the Sharing Stories project. I think it's incredibly important. And of course, Dr. Linda Garcia Merchant, who's the director of the Humanities, Data Humanities? What is it called? Someone help me. Thank you. Digital, I should know this by heart now, but she has really taken a leading role on that. I also want to acknowledge Cynthia Orozco, Dr. Cynthia Orozco, who's here with us. She is an esteemed Chicana historian and certainly has been a supporter of mine for many years, someone whose work I value quite a bit and has been an inspiration for me, and who was an external reviewer for my book. The commentary she made on my book really made it so much stronger and in fact resulted in the final chapter of the book. I added a chapter as a result of her feedback. I also just want to give a shout out to my daughter who's here with me, recently graduated from college and also a great source of support for me personally, and has worked on the Chicana por mi Raza project. The archive in my mother's home refuses to stay in its proper place. Spreading tendrils of memory promiscuously across her office, it spills over, okay, there we go. It spills over into unexpected domestic terrains, often surprising you like a ghost in its sudden appearance. Indeed, on any given morning, you might encounter, as I have, a yellowed movement newspaper lying inauspiciously on the breakfast table, pulled from its resting place in some repurposed box for a quick consultation about events long past, or perhaps in the service of some new campaign that has captured her attention. My mother did not come by this wealth of materials by accident. It was carefully gathered over a lifetime of activism in grassroots mobilizations, feminist collecting projects, institutional initiatives, and political formations. As one of the foremost voices in the early development of Chicana feminist knowledge, María Cotera, my mother, produced a substantial oeuvre of feminist writing, including 2 books, Diosa y Hembra, The History and Heritage of Chicanas in the U.S. in 1976, and The Chicana Feminist in 1977, as well as numerous bibliographies, source books, and historical essays. In addition to this literary production, she amassed a large collection of materials on Chicanas, Latinas, lesbians, and women of color through her various information projects, including the Chicana Research and Learning Center, which she established in Austin, Texas in 1974. My mother's sprawling personal collection is not unique. In fact, it is just one node in a stunningly rich and largely unexplored constellation of Chicana memory that haunts the official archive of multiple historiographic imaginaries, including the women's movement, the Chicano movement, and gay liberation. Preserved in boxes in living rooms, basements, home offices, garages, and storage units, this submerged archive documents an archipelago of Chicana knowledge in the 1960s and 1970s that expands our current genealogy of the development of women of color discourse. We might think of the collections amassed and carefully preserved by Chicanas like my mother as a kind of composite text, an as yet unwritten history of intellectual and organizational labor that documents the conditions of articulation that brought us to the place we are now, a place in which we can write and speak about Chicana feminisms in our classrooms, conferences, and scholarly publications. For the past 15 years, I've made a scholarly home in this dispersed archipelago of Chicana memory, piecing together a story of becoming from the scattered traces preserved in women's personal collections. I've sought out these archival traces, tracking the networks and knowledge projects that they document, not only in the interest of historiographic justice, but also because I believe that the futures interrupted, the paths not taken, and the truncated possibilities to which they bear witness remain relevant to our work as scholar activists in the present moment. In my book, Fleshing the Archive, I offer an intimate genealogy of Chicana feminist knowledge praxis that tracks the strategies Chicanas deployed as they moved in, through, and around sites of social, political, and institutional power in the late 20th century. The book draws directly from archival documents and oral histories collected by the Chicana por mi Raza project. It's called the Chicana por mi Raza Digital Memory Collective, and in the Q&A I can respond to why it's called that and not an archive or a digital repository, et cetera. So CPMR is a non-custodial digital archive that I launched with Linda Garcia Merchant in 2009. It currently houses hundreds of oral history video recordings with Chicanas and Latinas active in the movement years, as well as thousands of digitized items from their personal collections. The repository now has somewhere between 30 to 40,000 objects in it. It is login protected. It's not open to the public, but if you are interested, we can talk about joining our collective and working on it. I would say about 45, maybe 50% of the materials are cataloged and searchable. So there's a lot of work to be done. Let's see. So in my book, Fleshing the Archive, I turn to this rich composite text to tell a story about the radical knowledge forms that Chicanas produced in the movement years, charting what Emma Perez has called the sitios y lenguas, or the sites and discourses of these modalities of Chicana knowledge-making, from María Cotera's work as an information specialist and a feminist writer in Texas, to the generation of Chicana scholar activists who carved out a space for the study of la mujer in California in the beginnings of Chicano studies, to the queer world-making of the poet, scholar, and filmmaker Osa Hidalgo de la Riva. Fleshing the Archive surfaces a hidden genealogy that demonstrates how these ephemeral and always precarious efforts to reimagine knowledge as a collective and community-building endeavor speak to the urgencies of the present moment. In this genealogy of knowledge praxis, I move beyond simply summoning the spectral presence of Chicanas in the movement years as stable subjects that can be recovered and accorded their proper place in history, in order to explore the epistemological and methodological implications of their persistent haunting and our equally persistent desire to revisit the utopian imaginaries of the past. Indeed, in building the archive, the archive of embodied and documentary memory from which my book draws, I've experienced striking resonances between our 21st century Chicanx digital praxis and the knowledge projects that Chicanas undertook in the 1970s, including our shared impulse to create collaborative sites of information exchange, to challenge the hierarchies of the university, to expand our pedagogy beyond the classroom, and to imagine radical futures in the shadow of institutional precarity. These moments of startling convergence surface hidden technologies of resistance that beckon us to recognize ourselves in the radical futures that Chicanas imagined in the 1970s. As José Esteban Muñoz so eloquently put it in Cruising Utopia, his own queer genealogy of praxis, we must, quote, think and feel a then and there, not only to uncover history, a history formerly hidden from view, but also to challenge the here and now's totalizing rendering of reality. So basically, I do want to pause here because it feels especially totalizing now. And so I want to say, looking to the past isn't just like a hagiography or a romanticism or nostalgia, right? It gives us a different kind of future to imagine. So I look to the past to think about the future. Searching the landscape of truncated utopian possibilities to construct my own genealogy of praxis, I surface not only the who, what, and when and where of important Chicana knowledge formations in the 1970s, but also, importantly, the how. For me, it is precisely this question of the nature of our praxis that links contemporary efforts to transform the, quote, totalizing rendering of reality to the work of the generation that preceded us. A genealogy grounded in praxis offers up, in Muñoz's words, blueprints and schemata of a forward-dawning futurity. Indeed, a focus on praxis reveals not only the historical and continuing conditions of precarity in which Chicana knowledge is elaborated, but also a long tradition of imagining otherwise, from community-based research and cultural centers to the development of Chicana bibliographies, syllabi, and curricula and collectives that would establish a foothold for Chicana feminist studies in the academy, to our current efforts to document and preserve Chicana history through digital tools. In its simplest definition, praxis means process, but as a philosophical concept, it also poses an important challenge to the mind-body, thought-action binary that often structures our understanding of knowledge and its practical applications. Praxis is at the center of Karl Marx's conceptualization of human activity and agency, in that it describes the, quote, free, universal, creative, and self-creative activity and agency through which man, or woman, to update Marx, creates, makes, produces, and changes, i.e. shapes, his historical human world and himself, an activity specific to man through which he is basically differentiated from all other beings. Now, we can quibble with Marx's human focus here, as a lot of post-humanists have, but I just want to sort of detail this part of his conception of praxis. The Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire took up this humanistic strain in Marx's thinking about praxis, placing it at the center of his conceptualization of concientizao, right? Concientización, or consciousness raising, a horizontal and dialogical process of knowledge creation whereby individuals unmask the nature of oppression, here we go, through collective reflection and action. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was published in 1968 and read widely by movement organizers in the late 1960s and 70s, particularly those engaged in the struggle for Chicano studies, Freire outlines the stakes of what was essentially an educational process, noting that one of the greatest obstacles to the achievement of liberation is that oppressive reality absorbs those within it and thereby acts to submerge human beings' consciousness. Functionally, oppression is domesticating. To no longer be prey to its force, one must emerge from it and turn upon it. This can only be done by means of praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. This concept of praxis as reflection and action was central to the elaboration of movement theories of oppression, as well as the development of strategies for social transformation. There we go. For example, consciousness-raising sessions, which were not exclusive to the women's movement, although we tend to think of this as a central praxis of the women's movement, consciousness-raising sessions happened all over the movement spaces, right? Not exclusively in women's spaces. And they were essentially revolutionary educational projects that engaged participants in reading, study, reflection, and what Freire called problem posing, with the specific aim of developing strategies for social change. Direct actions that were a result of this process of concientización would also be analyzed and evaluated through a process of crítica, autocrítica, criticism, autocriticism, and thus they actively shaped evolving theories and practices of social change. As applied in movement context, praxis was the dialectical entwinement of theory, reflection, and action creation, and thus necessitated that theory be put in the service of social transformation, and in turn that lived experiences inform theories of oppression. You never have an abstract theory in this idea of praxis. Chicana knowledge praxis in the 1970s and 1980s operated at the intersection of popular education and organizing activities, as well as academic knowledge systems. While there were several institutionally based efforts to develop curricula and increase numbers of faculty who were committed to building programs of study, Chicana knowledge projects in this period were not limited to academic institutions. Instead, they engaged on all fronts of the struggle for social justice, from political organizing to writing and research to the production of poetry, stories, and visual images that shaped the movement imaginary. Refusing to wait for institutional recognition to produce knowledge, Chicanas mostly self-published their poetry, essays, books, newspapers, and bibliographies in limited runs that were later duplicated and distributed widely. through mimeographs. This was even before the time of photocopy machines, right? And so these materials were produced in-house, usually by organizations, and then distributed to meetings and classrooms. Examples of this independent publishing practice, and these are all drawn from our archive. Okay, so these images are from materials we've collected. So examples of this independent publishing practice include Encuentro Femenil, published by Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc in California, widely recognized as the first Chicana feminist journal ever to appear. Mama Safo, The People's Press, published in 1973 and 74, which was the first Chicana lesbian newsletter published by Osa Hidalgo de la Riva and her sister Liz Hidalgo de la Riva, distributed in Stockton and mostly, so this is a fascinating document that shows that there was a very active gay and lesbian life in Stockton, California. Usually when we talk about gay and lesbian history, we tend to focus on the Bay Area, but not Stockton, right? And there's great advertisements too for gay-friendly clubs and florists and all kinds of stuff. So it's a beautiful, very interesting document. And also very early in the history of Chicana lesbian history, right? So we're talking 1973 or so. And by the way, when Osa and her sister Liz published this, Liz was, I think, 16. So there's a lot of gay and lesbian high school writing in here from her friends. Okay. Other examples include María Cotera's foundational text, Diosa y Hembra, published in 1976, and the Chicana Feminist, published in 1977. Chicana feminist newspapers like Hijas de Cuauhtémoc and El Popo Femenil, as well as collections of writing produced by students in early classes on La Chicana. There's Popo Femenil. And by the way, Popo Femenil is an interesting example because it was a product of a class that Ana Nieto Gomez taught at Northridge, but she had several women who were editors of the paper El Popo, which was a Chicano student newspaper, and were really frustrated with the macho dynamics of the paper's publication. So they, in her class, planned a takeover of the paper and called it El Popo Femenil. And which is funny too, if y'all, well, I won't get into it, but like El Popo, Popo Capetel, right? It's a classic Mexican legend of the two mountains outside of Mexico City where the warrior is holding the dying princess. And so to appropriate El Popo, which is a kind of masculinized warrior figure of the Aztec tradition, and call it El Popo Femenil is kind of awesome. Okay. Oh, right. And so here are some examples of other productions, new magazines of writing produced in Chicana feminist classes. These writings, right, before the advent of María Cotera's volume, Diosa y Hembra, that was taught in classes after 76, right? It was these magazines and newspapers that were taught as the first Chicana curriculum. So Chicana students created newspapers so that they could answer the critique that, well, why do you want a class on La Mujer? You don't have any publications to teach. So they created them. They did the research and created these publications. And they would become a core curriculum in these first Chicana classes. They were central to the development of Chicana studies curriculum in the academy. While some early publications did emerge as a result of institutional support, like Hembra, right, a single-issued journal that was edited by Inés Hernández Ávila, who's from Houston, but was teaching at the time in Austin. This magazine, publication received funding from an MLA, a Modern Language Association grant. Nevertheless, right, the person who helped them organize this was someone from outside the academy, María Cotera, right? And so it had a circulation that was far beyond the academy. It wasn't just in the academy. So the circulation of these texts must be understood as kind of crossing the boundaries between the academy and the community. So in fleshing the archive, I explored these transgressive sitios y lenguas of Chicana knowledge production in order to document the complex and heterogeneous modes through which women forged a knowledge practice at the center or at the intersection of multiple movement spaces in the community and the academy, tracing the various knowledge-building initiatives that Chicanas undertook inside and outside the academy, from María Cotera's radical information projects to the struggle of for Chicana studies in California to Osa Hidalgo de la Riva's queer mujerista praxis. I offer not only an intellectual genealogy grounded in memory, both embodied and documentary, but also an invitation to reimagine our own work as scholars and scholar activists through a dialogue with the past. So I'm just going to sort of take you through the book and tell you about the different parts of it. So I set the scene for this dialogic engagement between the present and the past in chapter 1 by explicating, and it's called Fleshing the Archive, so it's the title of the book, by explicating the approach to archival recovery at the center of the Chicana por mi Raza project. Building on the work of feminist and queer scholars who have themselves turned to personal collections and embodied memory to address silences about the past, I argue that our Chicanx digital praxis fleshes the archive of movement history, engaging it as a site of dialogue and encounter. Here we go. Rather than as a stable object to be interpreted. This approach challenges the traditional relation of production between archives as objects of analysis and scholars as agents of interpretation. I have other images here. Here we go. And these are all scenes of encuentro. Oh, there should be others, but we'll do with these. This is fun. So yeah, the purpose is to think of the sort of site of research as a dialogue or an encuentro rather than a stable object, the archive as a stable object to be interpreted. This approach challenges a traditional relation of production between archives as objects of analysis and scholars as agents of interpretation, a relation that transforms radical memory into what Achille Mbembe has called evidence, and thereby its traces into remains. Our Chicanx digital praxis embraces a different set of methodological procedures, centering collaboration, reciprocity, relatedness, and a shared obligation to the past, present, and future, lifting the veils on the philosophies, methodologies, and ethical practices of our approach to historical recovery, which have been inspired by the very knowledge projects it has uncovered. I explore how affect, haunting, and experiences of what Avery Gordon has called transformative recognition defamiliarize objectivist norms of history and the accounts of the past that they have produced. Like Gloria Anzaldua's Autohistoria, fleshing the archive is a praxis of historical analysis that weaves together multiple strands of memory: the personal, the collective, the documentary, allowing us to write with the past rather than about it. And this idea of writing with the past is very distinct to this particular project because the women that I'm documenting are still alive and you have obligations to them. Every woman who has been written about in this book has read several iterations of the chapters that include them. And so there's accountability built into this dialogical process. So it's not the same as looking at an archive, you know, from the 19th century, right? Where at most the ghosts might haunt you and tell you you're doing it wrong or your interpretation is wrong at some place in the back of your mind, right? These women, including my own mother, have read these chapters quite closely. Okay. And I tell the book, after kind of setting the scene for how the material for the book was collected in that first chapter, which I think it's important to start with the presence. You know, just as an explanation, I wanted to center the praxis that uncovered the materials themselves, to lift the veil of how the sausage is made, essentially, and also to show the ethical framework behind it, right? So I need people to understand that this is how I collected the book. So if you're expecting a book that, you know, was collected or engaging archives in a certain kind of way, this one's not it. This one's very intimate. This is very personal. And so I really want to set the scene for that research, right? But throughout the book, I really tell stories. And a lot of these are stories of becoming, right? So I worried a little bit that like theory heads would find this too simplistic, but I kept coming back to story and narrative, and I almost couldn't help myself. So you can think about the different chapters of the book as kind of critical biographies in a certain way, or they're not strictly biographical. And sometimes they're about multiple women working in concert together, right? Not just about a single woman, right? So these stories, because they're really about praxis, they're about how things get done, right? So these stories of Chicana knowledge praxis that I have chosen to trace in the book were activated by moments of transformative recognition, when the present and the past collided for me and opened up novel sites of historical inquiry and new ways of thinking about our work as scholar activists, really in dialogue with the past. So these are moments, and I begin each chapter with these moments of kind of shock and recognition, like recognizing myself in these women and the kind of work they're doing. Because I should say, building this archive with Linda has been not just a labor of love, but often unrecognized by the traditional academy, right? So we get it. And so that transformative recognition, I think, is a really generative place to think about like how much has changed and how much remains the same, right? And what kinds of structures are we engaging and fighting with, and how are those structures similar to the structures, you know, that these women that I'm tracing also engaged with. So chapters 2 and 3, and this is really intimate, focus on my mother. Dangerous territory, María Cotera, and her work to build new informatic futures of Chicana knowledge production. Drawing from materials in her substantial personal archives, as well as multiple oral history interviews and pláticas spanning from 1973 to 2020, I examine how she integrated her work as an organizer, librarian, archivist, and, quote, information specialist, which is always how she understood herself, as she moved between institutional formations and activist spaces outside of the academy. In chapter 2, La Tlamatini, Information as a Praxis of Freedom, I show how my mother's information philosophy was grounded in her lived experience as a Chicana working within and against ideologies of knowledge, both movement ideologies and institutional ideologies, that sustain relations of domination and subordination. In response to these lived contradictions, she developed a radical approach to information, what I call her Tlamatini information praxis, that challenged the containment of knowledge in institutions and imagined alternative information hubs, and this is her language, where knowledge by and for the community could be preserved and shared. The chapter begins with a meditation on a startling discovery of myself in the archive, in a newspaper article, right? On my mother's work as a librarian in Crystal City, Texas, where a Chicano revolution took place in 1970. Contemplating the liberatory information futures that my mother imagined in the late 60s and into the early 70s as she moved from institutional libraries to more radical information projects like El Colegio Jacinto Treviño in Mercedes, Texas. I think I might have a picture of this. There we go. And this is the picture that's on the cover of the book. And I can tell you about the fight I had with the press over this picture later. It's a funny story. They won, probably for good reason. So I trace the sort of movement between like institutional sites of information production and more radical sites outside of the institution, like El Colegio Jacinto Treviño, Mercedes, Texas, which was an independent Chicano college that she helped found. I explore this movement from the center to the margin as a praxis of fugitivity, exemplified by her habit of stealing the master's tools to create revolutionary information infrastructures that fed the movement. Oh, Okay. In chapter 3, Tlamatini Infrastructures in the Shadow of Precarity, I show how this radical Tlamatini praxis was carried over into her work on autonomous information infrastructure projects in the 1970s. First with Juarez Lincoln. There might be another picture. Okay. Sorry, this is a little, please listen to me. Can you go over there? Oh, there we are. It worked. Okay, sorry. But maybe you should go over there just in case. And forward. See, it's so nice having a research assistant travel with me. So in chapter 3, I show how this radical Tlamatini praxis was carried over into her work on autonomous information infrastructure projects in the 1970s. And I go deep into information studies in the 70s here. Deep. I really nerded out. With these infrastructure projects in the 1970s, first with Juarez Lincoln University, that's a brochure for Juarez Lincoln University in Austin, another independent college where she ran the National Migrant Information Clearinghouse, which is a fascinating information project. And later, with her own feminist information project, the Chicana Research and Learning Center, which was established by her and Olivia Evie Chapa in 1973, and was the first research center dedicated entirely to Chicanas and women of color. Significantly, the center was not based in the university. Instead, it was imagined as a community knowledge hub that could provide the necessary resources for the development of Chicana studies within the developing fields of Chicano studies and women's studies, flipping the conventional script for how knowledge flows from the university to the community. Cotera and her collaborators used the CRLC to diversify the curriculum from outside the institution. Together, chapters 2 and 3 offer an alternative history of information science and its radical application in Chicana knowledge praxis, a history that speaks quite intimately to my own investments as a developer of contemporary Chicana information hubs. This is what I mean by radical and transformative recognition. I thought Linda and I were inventing an entirely new digital humanities project, and then when I started talking to her about her own information theories, I was like, oh, basically she already did it. Okay, thanks, Mom. So in the second half of the book, yeah. Oh, there's the Migrant Information Research Project. Keep going. Oh, I missed a few. There's the concept paper. All right, thank you. In the second half of the book, I pivot to California and to a generation of Chicana feminist scholar activists who built Chicana studies in the 1970s. In chapter 4, X marks the spot, mapping the sitios y lenguas of Chicana studies in California, 1969 to 1971. We look at a very short period of time because a lot happened, right? I follow the network of Chicana activists, feminists that emerged in the wake of the 1969 Santa Barbara Conference, widely regarded as the foundational moment in the field of Chicano studies. And so these are some of the women that were part of this network. They were largely from LA and San Diego, but also from the Bay Area. Documenting the largely invisible institutional labor that these women undertook in organizations like the Chicano Council on Higher Education, a formation that has been mostly ignored in historical examinations of the field in favor of the development of departments or of mecha, right? So there's been lots of histories about departments, or histories of Chicano studies that focus on departments and mecha. And so what I argue is basically by not focusing on certain organizations where Chicanas were quite active in making them, in their contributions, we've kind of missed an important part or the role that they played in the development of Chicano studies. So I show how Chicanas mobilized emergent institutional and organizing networks like CHE to challenge Chicano studies from within. So this chapter also opens with a startling archival recovery, a map, a hand-drawn map produced at a Che conference by members of the newly formed Chicana Ad Hoc Committee. Accompanied by extensive meeting notes, the map outlines a plan of action for developing Chicana studies across the state that is not unlike the El Plan de Santa Barbara, if somewhat less grandiose in its statements. This archival treasure map reveals the networks of scholar activists that promoted Chicana organizing on campuses across the state, developed the first Chicana curriculum, and taught the first Chicana studies classes. So I just want to point out, it's got a legend, right? It was drawn up at a meeting where Chicanas did an intervention at the Che meeting and said, no more, second fiddle, basically. But they also created this whole plan of action for what they were going to do. And notably, this plan of action, it resulted in Las Hijas de Cuauhtémoc publishing the first Chicana newspaper. Came out of this plan. Oh, sorry. Indeed, the advocacy of the Chicana Ad Hoc Committee of Che bore immediate fruit in 1971, when Ana Nieto Gomez, pictured here, was the first woman hired to teach classes on La Mujer at Cal State Northridge, the very first Chicana to ever teach a Chicana curriculum at Northridge or anywhere in California, which was Northridge, just to reinforce, was home to one of the most significant Chicano studies departments in California. And perhaps you've heard of Dr. Rudy Acuña, the father of Chicano Studies. He was the chair of the Chicano Studies department at Northridge. In Chapter 5, Beyond a History of Violence, Tracing the Knowledge Modalities of Chicana Studies in the 1970s, I focus in on the innovative feminist pedagogy that developed in this first period of growth for Chicana studies. And I explore how Chicanas use the classroom as an alternative site for organizing and knowledge production, surveying the syllabi and assignments for classes in two predominant centers of Chicana feminist thought, San Diego State University and California State University, Northridge. I show how the consciousness-raising group organizing model of the late 1960s was carried over into the first classes on La Mujer, and how Chicanas mobilized the classroom as a nerve center, in Ana Nieto Gomez's words, for knowledge production in the 1970s. One particularly illuminating example of this pedagogical praxis is La Semana de la Mujer. There we go. And here's a program. It's hard to see, but so Semana de la Mujer was organized by one of Ana Nieto Gomez's classes, and it was a week-long forum devoted to the Chicana, which was conceived as a student project in the La Chicana Today class in the fall of 1972, and was carried out through several individual studies classes that she taught the following semester. So students not only organized the week's activities, which included scholarly lectures and recruitment events for the community, they also reported on it for a special issue of El Popo, the student newspaper which they called El Popo Femenil. And there it is, right? In these chapters on Chicana studies in California, I shift attention from the institutions, organizations, and individuals that have been centered in histories of the formation of Chicano studies as a field to the mostly ignored spaces, networks, and knowledge-making modalities of the Chicana feminist scholar activist in order to tell the story of Chicano studies in a different voice. Centering new historical subjects and sites of inquiry, this voice gives narrative form to a Chicana knowledge praxis that move between and within multiple sites, from institutional formations to the classroom to communities of struggle outside the university. My analysis of these various efforts demonstrates how Chicana knowledge praxis in the early 1970s was collaborative, transgenerational, and institutionally unruly, directed not only toward building a field, but also to addressing the most pressing needs of women in the community. It represented one possible future for the field of Chicano studies, a path that was not followed, but still redolent with possibility for us today. The concluding chapter, thank you, Cynthia Orozco. This is the one I added, and it nearly killed me, but I'm glad I added it. So the concluding chapter, Mujerista Genealogies, Encuentros in the Queer Archive, was inspired by the startling convergences between the filmmaker Osa Hidalgo de la Riva's mujerista theory and praxis and our own Chicanx digital praxis. Drawing from a large collection of materials in Hidalgo de la Riva's personal archive that document 3 generations of queer mujerista practitioners in her family, I trace an intergenerational genealogy of mujerista praxis. Both the Mujeres de la Riva archive, as Osa de la Riva insists on naming it. So when we were collecting her archive, we were calling it the Osa Hidalgo de la Riva History Project, and she insisted that it be called the Mujeres de la Riva. What we didn't understand at first is that she had become the caretaker for her entire 3 generations of her family's archive. And so she had it in 2 storage containers in Santa Cruz. And just to say she's living in an assisted living, not assisted living, but low-income housing. She has very little money, but she's sustained the payments on these materials that she's kept from her family's history. All right. So both the Mujeres de la Riva archive and their embodied intergenerational memory tell an underground story, as Osa puts it, of lesbian sexuality in the late 20th century that challenges what Horacio Roque Ramirez has termed the narrative exclusions of both the Chicano movement and gay and lesbian historiography. Indeed, if Chicanas are largely absent or marginalized from accounts of the Chicano movement, lesbianas, as many scholars have argued, have been invisibilized by the silences around sexuality within movement spaces, which limited discussions of sexual politics to a heteronormative frame, including within Chicana feminism. So there have been many arguments of how Chicana feminist self-narration of their history has erased lesbians in the formation of Chicana feminist thought. Breaking this silence, the Mujeres de la Riva archive offers a transgenerational story of lesbian of color experience that defamiliarizes existing genealogies and historical frameworks of the movement era, at once personal and collective. This underground story includes the experiences of women in Osa's matrilineal circle, stories from her Aunt Sally, Celia de la Riva Rubio, this is her book, who navigated the repressive social and political landscape of the 1940s and 50s as a butch-identified lesbian. Experiences she later wrote about in the 1990s in her book Lágrimas y Cadenas, which was published in Morelia, Mexico. But this includes poems from the 40s and 50s about gay life in Stockton, which is just incredible. It itself is an archive, but it was in Osa's archive. All right. The archive also documents the experiences of Osa's mother, Lola de la Riva, who moved from Stockton to Los Angeles in 1972 with 3 children in tow to enroll as a student in the School of Fine Arts and Chicano Studies at Long Beach, right, which just 2 years before Ana Nieto Gomez and her collaborators had published Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, right? So these stories are very close together, right? So she moves to Long Beach in the 1970s and opens the Centro de Arte in her home, her family home in Long Beach, California, which she identified as the only lesbian identified Chicano art center in the 1970s. Eventually, she herself came out as a lesbian in the 1980s. Also recalls how as a young, out, dark-skinned lesbian, she herself navigated quite different sexual, racial, and class contradictions in the political upsurges of the 1970s, from the Chicano movement to the women's movement to gay liberation. In response to these contradictions, Las Mujeres de la Riva, Osa, her mother, and her younger sister Liz, who was 15 at the time, formed the Mestiza Colectiva in the early 1970s. Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. And they, in the early 1970s, which was run out of the Centro de Arte, the Mestiza Colectiva organized art exhibits and poetry readings and published Chicana lesbian newsletters like Mama Safo and the People's Press, right? Delivering them on their motorcycles to their hometown in Stockton. The Mestiza Colectiva and Lola's Centro de Arte are examples of lesbian of color formations hidden in plain sight in the movement years, newly revealed by Osa Hidalgo's de la Riva's queer memory keeping. Following the scattered traces of queer memory in the Mujeres de la Riva archive, I reconstruct, in the words of Liliana Gonzalez and Stacy Macias, a, quote, Chicana lesbian body politic forged at the crossroads of Chicanismo, women of color feminism, lesbian identity politics, working class consciousness, and transnational solidarity sensibilities. Like the archival collection from which it draws, Fleshing the Archive explores this genealogy of Chicana feminist praxis to surface memory and heal the haunting intergenerational wound of historiographic erasure. This aim resonates with what Gloria Ansaldúa has described, the Coyolxauhqui imperative, quote, the impulse to write something down, the desire and the urgency to communicate, to make meaning, to make sense of things, to create myself through this knowledge-producing act. For Ansaldúa, the Coyolxauhqui imperative is not only the, quote, struggle to heal oneself and heal the sustos resulting from woundings, traumas, racism, and other acts of violation que echan pedazos de nuestras almas, split us, scatter our energies, and haunt us, but it's also the act of calling back those pieces of the self-soul that have been dispersed or lost. Both the scholarly impulse to record, recover, and reevaluate the past, and a gesture of mourning and remembering a self and potentiality that has been lost or scattered. The Coyolxauhqui imperative is an effort to heal and achieve integration in the face of historical erasure and temporal fragmentation. As Ansaldúa has noted, when fragmentations occur, you fall apart and feel as though you've been expelled from paradise. Coyolxauhqui is my symbol for the necessary process of dismemberment and fragmentation, of seeing that self or the situations you're embroiled in differently. It is also my symbol of reconstruction and reframing, one that allows for putting the pieces together in a new way. The Coyolxauhqui imperative is an ongoing process of making and unmaking. There is never any resolution, just the process of healing. In Fleshing the Archive, I too put the pieces together in a new way to recover the radical traces of Chicana knowledge praxis from an alternative archive that is itself a reassemblage of documentary evidence and personal memory. This archival assemblage includes materials digitized by Chicana por mi Raza, oral histories collected on our many trips, unrecorded conversations on the phone or in person where an insight was shared, documents in institutional archives, online collections like the Educational Resources Information Center, ERIC. By the way, it's still up. The Trump administration has threatened to take it down, but it's a great source of information on funded projects from the 1970s. But also scholarly books and articles about the Chicano movement and Chicano studies, which are grounded in their own eclectic and idiosyncratic archives. If you've ever read Rudy Acuña's account of the building of Chicano studies, it's basically like he went through his file cabinet and just talks about things as he pulls them out. So I just want to point out that Chicano historians have their own eclectic archives, right? And most, like Carlos Muñoz's Youth Identity Power, that's his own archive. He wrote it before there was an established archive. He donated that archive, right? So, yeah, just want to point that out. I also draw from obscure publications that transgress the boundary between primary and secondary documents, like El Plan de Santa Bárbara, as well as unpublished manuscripts and position papers, among many other items left scattered in the dustbin of history as a result of institutional neglect. Examining this archival wreckage closely, looking for associative paths, moments of startling convergence, when multiple documents begin to speak together, we can begin to see a different landscape emerge with new points of interest, new sites of analysis, and new sitios y lenguas of Chicana feminist discourse. more than simply offering an intellectual history. In this book, I invite us to trace the connective tissue between the knowledge projects of an earlier generation and our own work and commitments as Chicana scholar activists today. Indeed, I've adopted many of the movidas and technologies of my antepasadas in my own navigations of the increasingly precarious minefield that is the academy today. For example, and this is my last example, in my classes on Chicana feminism in the 1960s and 1970s, I draw liberally from materials in the Chicana por mi Raza Digital Memory Collective repository, including the newspapers, magazines, and journals that I discuss in this book. But rather than just read the archive for its historical insights, I ask students to add to it by producing their own publications, like Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, Visión, Imágenes de la Chicana, and the People's Press. Hey, thanks. You predicted. And many of the examples of print culture that my students closely study over the course of the semester, the publications that they produce each semester speak to the urgencies of their particular moment, but they also speak to the past, and perhaps most importantly, to the future. Thus, in telling a story of Chicana knowledge praxis that intentionally thins the temporal distance between multiple sites of memory, I want to make visible how Chicana knowledge praxis has consistently moved in and through scales of power, social, cultural, and political, to create new sitios y lenguas where we can survive and thrive. By lifting the curtain on the moments of transformative recognition that arise in our encounters with the Chicana past, I beckon readers to reconstruct and to reframe our shared history and to imagine new futures with it, to put Coyolxauhqui back together again, piece by scattered piece. Thank you. Oh, there. So I will say, just to launch us, that I got into a big fight with the press about this image, which I did not want to use. I know some of y'all think I must be crazy because it's such a sexy image, which is why they wanted to use it. But I just felt like my dad was upstaging my mom in the back, like, you know, with his bigotes, with his moving bigotes. I was like, and plus he's wearing like a really shiny keychain, and I was so distracted by him. But my mother talked me down from the ledge, and she was like, no, you know, she read the image in a feminist way. But anyway. Yeah, happy to take questions from y'all, if anyone feels so inclined. Yes.
You had talked a little bit about Chicana por mi Raza and, you know, wanting this sort of, what did you say, transformative recognition of the work that these women had done, the work that they've been collecting. And I'm curious about the conversations that you've had starting the project in making it sort of, you know, you need a login, you have to join the collective instead of just putting it out there on the internet. So I'm curious about those conversations about protecting this work, but also trying to share it at the same time.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's especially relevant in the time of web crawlers and AI. It's just sucking up, right, all of this information. When we started to develop the project, you know, I think in part in working on the project, again, it's sort of what I want to kind of emphasize in the book and in this talk is that, you know, no project, no DH project or public history project starts without a theory, right? A theory of the world or a theory of why it's necessary or some kind of idea about why these materials should be collected, right? But in that moment of collecting, we began to feel a certain, Linda's here, looking at her, she can chime in, a certain kind of protectiveness, but also like in the materials that we were collecting and the projects that we were collecting, we saw kind of very consistent strain of questions of self-determination, particularly for women who, you know, self-determination was a big concept in the 1970s in movement spaces, right? This idea that a lot had been written about us in Black spaces, Chicano spaces, Puerto Rican spaces, right? Knowledge was a kind of contestatory domain, right? And social scientists had said we were this or that, or psychologists had said this, we have this kind of problem or that kind of problem. And so to make knowledge was a way to contest those representations from others about us. Nothing about us without us is the sort of phrase that you might hear, And so thinking more and more about intellectual self-determination and the tension between, like, a DH project wants discoverability, right? Or a public history project, right? It's public for a reason, right? And so there's this tension in the assumptions of DH, right? That discoverability is a value that is shared by all. But as we were kind of developing this project, it became very clear to us that self-determination was the most important value that we had. In reflecting what we were learning from the archive. And I think that's really what's important, the important insight that Chicana por mi Raza kind of gave me for this book is that the praxis that we were engaging in and the theory of that praxis was actively being shaped by the knowledges we were uncovering and by the examples, right, of knowledge projects that we were unearthing. And we were learning from them. So we weren't just learning about the past, but we were learning how to create a project, right, that had the ethics and the protocols that might not match up with other DH projects, which value discoverability, searchability, and all of these other things. But were more akin, right, to the projects we were collecting, right, and engaging with. And so I think that, kind of in hindsight, right, in hindsight, it's like I'm personally very happy in the age of AI, because a lot of radical, like, digital projects are having to rethink discoverability in the age of AI because, they're concerned about how this knowledge will get kind of churned into, the digital hallucinations that AI is producing, right? And how, so I think that's kind of, we wanted to protect the knowledge. And I just, something about the collective idea, obviously that idea of the collective comes out of the 1970s. It's not just a kind of, I don't want to suggest that we just go to the past and take their format and, like, put it on ours, but, like, learning about the collective nature of Chicana knowledge projects, like in Chicana Research and Learning Center, for example. Everybody who was researching and learning from that project was also contributing to it in some way. So for the Chicana Research and Learning, for the Chicana por mi Raza project, if you want to get a login and work in our archive, there's a lot of work to be done. We define work not as just you working extractively, not you, but anyone working extractively in the archive. We expect that if you're an expert, right, and you have a line of research and you want to look at these materials, that you also use your expertise to apply metadata, or help us catalog, right, or help us write collection descriptions. All of that work needs to be done. Because also, the reality is if we don't do certain things as a DH project, like discoverability, for example, make our materials discoverable to a broad public, we're not going to get a Mellon grant, right? Because there's certain biases baked into DH that, make our project just not really fundable. And so, we have a whole set of protocols, and one of them says, self-determination over visibility. And so visibility gives you, a Mellon grant gives you a certain kind of heft in the academy, right? And certainly resources. But what we found too is even when applying for somewhat smaller grants, that the objectives of those grants do not match ours. And a lot of times if you've ever done a DH project, like if you go for that big grant, it's not quite matching up with what your goals are, but you need the money, you end up kind of shifting over to what the nonprofit industrial complex wants and not what you need. And so I think, I like that you brought up transformative recognition in that sense, because I think that in doing the project and encountering all these knowledge, approaches to knowledge, that we both recognize ourselves in those processes, but also, sort of took from them certain, or reinforced in ourselves our sense that we should be a certain way, right? Because those, yeah, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so about this, when we started, you know, it was a collaborative effort. Maria was the scholar, I was the technologist.
She didn't have a PhD.
I didn't have a PhD. Had no intention of going back to grad. And so we got an opportunity, and because of the opportunity that we got, I said to Maria, and I'd always said this to Maria, nothing can be online until we can control this. Because I just had nightmares of Ana Nieto Gomez in the meshing and trying to explain to her how her
Can you imagine the AI?
how her materials would have, you know, ended up, and I was just like, okay, no, that can't happen. We've got to find another way. And so when the opportunity came, and Maria said, is this a good thing? I was like, oh, this is a great thing. Yes, we need to do this. But I understood what the scholarly research practice was.
We got a grant to try out this platform that we still use today on a platform called Clouder. And they supported us building up the repository on their server and using their platform. And now we have since migrated the repository to Texas Advanced Computing. But at the time, it was basically a data management system, but it was closed. It was a login protected data management system. So it's not like Omeka or, you know, more public. And by the way, we would break Omeka if we have all of our materials available. It would not.
So it was an opportunity when I said, no, this is a good thing. We'll get this developed. You know, everybody thought, well, that's a really nice project, but that's nice, you know, that's a really nice project. But nobody thought, there was incredible suspicion about this having done what we were collecting. It's much better now, but at the beginning, I would say the first 10 years, that's nice, but who's interested in that? Who would actually care about this? All the things that we knew weren't true.
But also like questions from librarians and archivists, like how, you know, what's the sustainability? How are you going to preserve it? Like, you know, nothing in the digital world is sustainable. I'm sorry, the Library of Alexandria was not sustainable. It burned to the ground. I know that's apocryphal, but it's just an example, right? Or like collections, we know, you know, that a lot of times libraries may even discard collections, right, to make room for new ones. Like, and so this idea that we were often getting from you know, people that I admire and have worked with, right, questions that for us, you know, were like impossible to answer because we were so marginal, and we continue to be. You know, it's almost like setting up a framework for what a digital archive can be that you can't possibly achieve because you don't have the resources, right? So most of the way we build the archive is through the Squatchy digital praxis, like catch as catch can, like we're gonna use, you know, a combination of free tools and tools in development to build this, but, you know, the whole question of preservation, if that is the definition of an archive, then we don't have the resources for that, right? We strive to preserve, right? And that's where the idea of encuentro really comes out of, because encuentro, you know, really is about like, not the collection itself, but the collective that gets built in the process of building the collection. So encuentro, I often say the archive is us. I remind students, it's like in that process of collecting and cataloging and interviewing and all of that, that is an archive. And you know, if that's our only archive at the end of this, then all the 15 years of labor may have been enough. I don't know. You know. Yes. Hi.
I want you to correct me if I analogy is wrong, but what you said, oppression is like a cage and praxis is the key that opens it. How do you adapt your praxis and modify the key when the cage is constantly fluid and changing because this is oppression?
Oh, wow. Well, so you put it much more eloquently than I did. So the first one to say that, acknowledge that. I think that's the benefit of praxis, right? So praxis is the practical, or is the application of theory, and then the transformation of theory when it no longer applies, right? So praxis is like something that is constantly mobile, right? And it's shifting and changing as conditions change. So a great way to think about this is like, let's say you have a theory about how to get the University of Texas not to close your department. So that's your theory. Like, I theorize that if I launch a social media campaign that is embarrassing to the university, that will have a certain result, right? You throw that out there, and it's very simple, it's obviously more complex, but you see how the institution reacts. You observe the impact, right, that your praxis has, or your practical application of your theory about what might happen, and then you reformat that theory. So theory is never static, right? It's constantly changing. And I wouldn't even say there's a distinction between theory and praxis for me. Like, all praxis is theory, and all theory, right, is a form of praxis, right? Often in the academy, I think what happens is we train students, right, to say, we're going to use the theory of Judith Butler to analyze X, an object, right? And that kind of really reinforces the idea that theory is something abstract, right, that is applied to something. But praxis is actually the incorporation, the dialogic or dialectical incorporation of theory and application, right? So the theory is constantly changing, and your application is also constantly changing as new theories are produced about what will be effective. But this is definitely in the context of oppression, right? Oppressive systems, and how you move inside of them, tactically, right? I don't know if that answered your question. I think you could answer the question better, actually.
No, I just mean like, I thought praxis was like a singular application, but from what you've been saying, praxis is tried and tested, like constantly changing application. So yeah, that just answered
Yeah.
the question.
I think the key is always changing.
Yeah, the key's not. I thought the key was solid.
Right. Or at least that's my understanding. There's probably like people, Marxists in here, who'd be like, that lady's crazy. That's not what Marx said. We even say Marx. Can we say that now? Am I being recorded?
Yeah, as someone who's interested in education, what would be the best way to implement this kind of knowledge and this representation into a K-12 classroom? Especially, let's have some mercy on the elementary schoolers and maybe in high school, right? How can we bring this kind of knowledge into the classroom?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. How long have you, what year are you?
This is my second semester, but
Okay. I mean, I think that,
She talk about your mom's the school she does with the kids.
I don't know enough about that quality. Yeah.
Or doesn't it?
I mean, there's a lot of radical education projects that were part of the 1960s. Like, I would say, okay, a great example is actually, I don't want to suggest this because it really isn't allowed nowadays, but the walkouts. Like, we talked about the walkouts in LA, right? The backstory of the walkouts is actually quite a bit more complex than just one sort of upsurge of students, right? It was actually college students, right, who were doing, they weren't really freedom schools, but they had sent these high school students to this summer camp opportunity, which was like basically a weekend to learn about how to get into college. But the college students actually used it as a way to teach them about their own history. And in that teaching about their own history, they realized like, oh, the history we're learning in high school is super racist, right? The college students were the first members of UMAS, United Mexican American Students, right, which later became MECHA. And a lot of them were the older siblings who had made it into college are the kids that were in these barrio high schools, right? And so when they started working with the kids, they were mentoring them not to just walk out and take direct, you don't ever do direct action, right, as the first thing. Direct action is usually the last thing, right? What do you start first? You do information gathering, right? And so the first thing these students did was they went across all the minority high schools and they did a questionnaire, a survey. By the way, the same thing happened in the Crystal City walkouts. They did a survey first, right? And so they got a sense of everything that was happening around their school, so applied, right, to come up with a set of survey questions is really an academic enterprise, right? Let's ask students how they're feeling. You have to, distribute your questionnaire across all the high schools. They took the findings to the Board of Education, and the Board of Education told them to get lost. So then the students were like, well, this makes us angry now, because we haven't been listened to. And then the next step, right, is to get the community involved and talk to their parents and say, here's our findings from the surveys, right? So it's this multi-step process, the end of which is the one we document in history usually, right? There is a great piece by Dolores Delgado Bernal called Grassroots Leadership Reconceptualized, which also focuses on praxis, and you know, her contention is we think of leadership as people in front of the mic, right? And those are the people that make it into the documentaries about the past, right? Because people use footage from news stories, right? And the people in front of the mic, the students in front of the mic, were always young men, right? So she's like, who was not in front of the mic? Like, who's not getting reported in this understanding of what happened with the Wildcats? She ends up talking to women, and then she ends up tracing the various steps that college students working with high school students had them go through, right? Which essentially are research. It was a research project. And so when I think about implementation, I also think about movidas in the current context that we're in right now. You have to be careful, right? But there's certain things you can do, like asking students to research. Let's do a survey. How are y'all feeling about your experience in high school? And I talk to freshmen all the time in my Chicana Reminiscence class, and anytime they learn about the radical history of the past, they're like, why didn't we know this? Right? So as part of this survey, like, you can ask things like, who's the civil rights leader that you know of, right? Cesar Chavez, they're all going to say the same thing, in the Chicana movement, right? And then you can say, have you heard of, you know, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, Ana Nieto Gomez? So inside the survey, right, you can say, like, who have you not, like, point out what they don't know, right? And one thing that I found with freshmen in my class who were just recently out of high school is they get really annoyed by things they don't know. Once they know don't know them. They're like, why didn't I learn this, right? So there are ways, I think, through kind of traditional formats to build consciousness in students. And I think, you know, those are really great ways, because they're research activities, essentially. Like, you know, you can also do after-school programs and things like that, which Desiree, we have a lot of students who actually have been through my class who are doing really interesting kind of freedom education projects. There's a great need with charter schools everywhere, like charter schools, you know, not happy about it, right? And what it's doing to public education in Texas in particular. However, they're a lot more loose, right? So there's opportunities in charter schools, like, you know, some of my students have taken advantage, former students have taken advantage of, you know, to insert kind of liberatory education in those spaces. So, I mean, I would go after the charter schools where it's more flexible, you know, and also think about research projects that are maybe not so obvious, like research a Chicana movement person or research, you know, but really about how are students feeling in this movement, right? Because that's how you, I think, you build consciousness really in that way. And students, nobody is, like, everyone's like hand-wringing about what happened in South Texas, you know, in Trump, like, went 97%, is 97% Latino and went 47% or maybe even higher for Trump. And, you know, the tragedy of young Latino men getting caught up in the manosphere. And, you know, I'm always like, you people are not born with political consciousness. What I have noticed is the Chicana movement and other social justice movements kind of gave up the ghost on this process of concientización, right? They just assume, like, if you're born with brown skin, you're somehow black skin, you're like already born. No, not already born into consciousness. It's a process, an education process, right? And so, you know, we haven't actually been doing political education in our communities enough. That may be changing. Right, but I kind of got off topic. But I do think, like, that, you know, that idea of political education, I feel like the right has done an excellent job of that, actually. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the right has done a great job of taking all the things the left did in the 1970s and implementing them with billions of dollars behind them, right? But all those tactics and movidas, those came straight out of the civil disobedience era. All of them. So what are we doing? Like, that's why I think like blogs, that kind of thing, like having students do blogs, write about their experiences. It does not have to be overly political because their lives are already political. It's just opening that, allowing them to see that, right? I think is important. Is it time?
It's maybe one more question.
With the legacies of colonialism in the Mexican community, both in Mexico and over here, how do you imagine like we create like a collective consciousness where indigenous people's history has been erased because of those systems of knowledge have been erased and like trying to I guess preserve them. I don't know if it's possible because like I don't know if they have like, the ability or like a lot of these things were maybe burned down. Like a lot of people that are like mestizos, like they have no way of like reconnecting or even like seeking it out. So I feel like the Mexican community, like yes, because we have an entire history, but because our history is very like complex and like it's a mesh of history. So how do you envision like a future where all of histories are taught and in conversation with each other, like, my ancestors did this bad thing to your ancestors, or like my ancestors did this bad thing to my ancestors, like within yourself. Because I feel like we need to like deal with that intergenerational trauma to be able to create a collective consciousness. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, that's a really easy question to answer. No, it's not. I would say, like, I would come back to Praxis. It's not so much the content, but how, right? Bringing people into consciousness, like, not so much like, what stories are you going to tell, although that is important, but it's like how you together kind of explore these issues, and what is your praxis? What are the ethics? How are you engaging this? Are you including Blackness also in that? I think that's kind of the major. More and more people are thinking about, mestizaje is not just being about like the European and the indigenous, but really about the long history of Blackness in Mexico in particular, right? Where I will just say, it is now common knowledge, right, that most enslaved people, the big proportion were taken to Mexico, right? And that's not anything that the Mexican government has dealt with, also not its anti-indigeneity, right? Essentially, and mestizaje has been used to cover over that. So, I think maybe like really kind of engaging with histories of enslavement and of genocide, which we've done a slightly better job of, but also like maybe not giving up the ghost of mestizaje. I do think mestizaje is an important concept, but like how do we take it and really use it as a way to kind of undo those colonial histories that include slavery? To me, this is the big thing, and the thing that has opened up, for me, the critique of mestizaje the most is the critique of Afro-mestizos, of that concept, right? Because I think once slavery comes into it, we have a fundamentally different understanding, right, of genocide and colonization. Right? But we can talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cotera, and to our audience for such a stimulating presentation and equally intelligent, smart questions from especially you students. We'd like to give special thanks to Iggy Harrison and his team at Streaming Media for their help in recording the event. And I'd also like to thank the team at Center for Public History, Dr. Wes Jackson, Dr. Sandra Davidson, also our student intern, Michael Voss, and everybody else, the other interns who have helped out with making this event possible. To learn more about the Center for Public History and our upcoming events, please visit our website, which is uh.edu/class/. houston.edu/CPH. Our next event, because we don't believe in slowing down, will be tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, again for making 2 events in 2 days possible. Tomorrow at 5:30 in Architecture 150, we will be celebrating the launch of the latest issue of Houston History Magazine, and that issue looks at immigration stories in Houston. So following, no doubt, on some of the themes from this afternoon. So I hope to see you at 5:30 tomorrow afternoon. And regardless, thank you for being here today.